Welcome to this event for the Wizzen Center for Open Learning. I'm Rabbi Gail Labovitz. I'm a member of the faculty at the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies, which is part of the AJU, and I'm here interviewing Zeeva Bukai, who is the author of The Anatomy of Exile, and also has written a number of other short stories and other items. And it's really a delight to welcome you here. Let me just start by giving you the floor and letting you tell us about your book.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you, Gail, and a little bit about The Anatomy of Exile. The Anatomy of Exile is a novel about, I'm so sorry about that. The Anatomy of Exile is a novel about Tamar Abadi and her family who leave Israel, immigrate to the United States after the death of a beloved sister who is killed in what appears to be a terror attack, but is in actuality a love affair with a Palestinian man that has ended in tragedy. In the United States, Tamar Abadi struggles desperately to keep her Jewish Israeli identity intact, to keep her family from assimilating, to be what she feels lost to the American melting pot. And what happens 5 years into being in the United States is that a Palestinian family moves into the apartment upstairs, and her daughter Ruby falls in love with the Mahmoudi's son Faisal. And Tamar does everything in her power to destroy that relationship. And in the process, all of this threatens to destroy her marriage, her family, and everything she has worked so hard to establish and to keep intact. That's basically the novel in a nutshell.
Great. So actually just one quick pause before I start asking some questions. People should just know that in the chat, you can find links about the Wizzen Center, about where to buy the book, and where to visit Zeeva's website. So I invite you to, also, we will be inviting you to share any questions through the Q&A, and those will be monitored. And we're going to talk for probably about half an hour or so, Zeeva and I. And then we will open up, we will screen maybe through some of the questions and pick out a few that we would like to actually present to Zeeva. So that's our plan. Okay, so my first question is, it seems to me authors, when you look at when they talk about how they came to their books, there's any number of routes that authors come to a story. Some authors will say, this character just popped into my head, or into my journal, or into my dreams. This scenario occurred to me. I want to tell a story that I, got from my family or from my own life or from something I read in the newspaper. Talk to us a little bit about your inspirations and the sources for this story as they came to you.
So the story actually began from the point of view of Ruby, the young daughter. And I actually wanted to explore what it was like for a teenage girl to be an immigrant in the United States and to fall in love with a Palestinian boy. Um, and I began there, but I soon very quickly began writing alternate chapters in the voice of Tamar, her mother, and really felt that that opened up most of the story for me. With that, I will say that there were other things that I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore a Mizrahi Ashkenazi family because my background was Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. My mother was born in Siberia in 1940. Um, she was from a Polish family. My father was from Damascus, Syria. And I left the Damascus, Syria part in the novel, but the Ashkenazi part I sort of deal with through Tamar's parents. But Tamar herself is a Sabra. She is born in Israel. She belongs in Israel, and that is how she feels. I also wanted to explore this idea of belonging, of identity, homeland, how people feel either rooted to a place, and then what it feels like to be displaced, to be in exile. And I wanted to also look at exile as a kind of prism, as all these different facets, an emotional exile from the people that we love, a psychological exile from ourselves, a sense of isolation, a physical exile to be literally uprooted and forced to go somewhere else. And finally, I also wanted to really take a look at Israel at a time that I kind of understood. I was born in Israel. I went back to Israel when I was 18. I went to school there and I stayed there. I lived there for 4 years before coming back to the United States. So that kind of shift, this sense of having one foot in one place and another foot in the other, always feeling like you don't quite belong. And yet when you go home, you don't quite belong there. And when you go to your other home, you don't fully belong there either. So this sense of kind of this dissonance, this uncomfortable feeling of being everywhere and nowhere at the same time. These were all things that I really wanted to look at. What was interesting is that unconsciously, I began to embed aspects of my family's history into the novel. So, for example, Salim, Tamar's husband, is from Damascus, and so is his sister Hadass. And Hadass is the one who has the relationship with the Palestinian man. My father, along with two of his brothers and my aunt, came to Israel from Damascus between 1945 and 1946. My father and his two younger brothers actually got there on June 6th, 1945, in what was called Operation 1000 Children. In Hebrew, it's known as Aliyat HaElef. And this was through both the Jewish Agency, the Jewish British Brigade, and a group of Syrian Jews who had crossed the Golan 10 or 15 years earlier, when they were in their late teens, early 20s. And it was, in a sense, to save Jewish children in Syria. My father was 13, his two brothers, one was 8 and the other was 11, left their families, left their parents, and came to Israel. The two youngest were placed on Tel Yosef, and my father was placed, which was a kibbutz, who basically took in many of these children, and then my father was placed on a moshav. The other aspect that bleeds into the novel is the Arab village. In the novel, it's called Kfar Ma'an, and it is actually based on an abandoned Arab village called Sheikh Munis, which is where Tel Aviv University now sits. Mm-hmm. And in 1949, well, in March of 1948, the Arab population, the residents of Sheikh Munis, left because they were terribly frightened. They were going to be caught in the middle of a war, and they abandoned the village. They exiled themselves to different parts of the West Bank, most especially Kalkilia and Tulkarem. And that's actually what happened. In my book, it's a little bit different, but overall, the same kind of history is embedded there. What happens after that, in 1949, after the War of Independence, the nascent Israeli government places 200 mostly Mizrahi and North African Jewish families onto Sheikh Munis. In my novel, the family that is placed there is Salim and his sister Hadass, who live on that. And
then Tamar goes to live with them as well.
Yes, and then Tamar, when she marries Salim, winds up living there as well for the first year or so. Well, actually, the first decade of their marriage before they move into a nice apartment in Tel Aviv. Exactly. Yes. So all of those things, and of course the Ashkenazi Mizrahi marriage as well, are things that are in the novel from aspects of my own life.
Yeah. So one question, by the way, you've already answered one of the questions that I wrote down for myself, which was about the use of the word exile in the title. One question that occurred to me is, this is in some ways, right, there is an aspect of the Romeo and Juliet story here.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious about, maybe to think together a little bit about the appeal of the Romeo and Juliet story, both for you as a writer, maybe for us as readers. What is the enduring appeal of that narrative, especially given that, at least in the original, it's tragedy?
Absolutely. And there are elements in the novel where, at the beginning between Hadass and Daoud Hamid, the Palestinian man that she's in love with and has a long-term affair with, that also ends in tragedy. I mean, that's at the beginning of the novel, and I'm
Mhm.
not giving anything away.
Right.
Um, and of course, we have the two young children, Ruby and Faisal. But we also have Tamar and Celine, two people from very different cultures.
Yes.
And I think the excitement, because I think that that's really what sort of draws us to the Romeo and Juliet trope or story, is a sense of excitement of loving the other, the forbidden, the taboo. I mean,
Mm.
we would all like to be able, or maybe not all, but many people like the fantasy of stepping out of their own kind of cultural milieu, and rebelling, basically. Many of these Romeo and Juliet stories have to do with young people because that is when we are most rebellious, right? We're asserting our independence. I think that's one of the things. And I also think that on the surface, there's a drama, I mean, not just on the surface, but that there's a drama inherent in a Romeo and Juliet story because there's a conflict. At the
Mhm.
beginning, it's all love and, roses and kind of candlelight and wonderful. It's romantic. And as I said before, forbidden, taboo, it's exciting. It's why Hollywood exists, right? This sense of being able to act out a fantasy.
Mhm.
And yet, the reality, I think, is very, very different. And that's a reality that I think I bring into the novel as well, is that because of those conflicts, a lot of issues arise to the surface.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe sometimes we have a little a fantasy also of somehow love will conquer all, and that all those divisions that we have, like, this time it won't be a tragedy. This time somehow we'll bridge the divides between us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because an element in the Romeo and Juliet trope is hope, right? There is always the hope, this sense that hope is springing eternal. We will be able, love, as you said, will conquer all. We will be different than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
We're not like everyone. And that's another aspect of this, is this feeling like this sense of uh, an individual, right? You are an individual. You're not like everybody else, falling for the same person, doing the same thing that all your friends or your family are doing. You're stepping outside of that little box that you've grown up in, right? You're outside
Yeah.
of it now. And it makes you feel good. It makes you feel alive.
It does, however, I think raise a related question. And this is the question of sort of, we all come from certain places and certain communities, and then we are trying to write perhaps about people outside of our communities. What does it mean? And so I see this, I kind of think, sort of in two ways in what you're doing here. Number one, you have already alluded to this. You're in an interesting place as someone who was born in Israel, has a great deal of Israeli family. I think thinks of yourself as an Israeli, but was also raised in New York,
Mhm.
and obviously has lived in the US for a significant period of time. So you're writing somewhere in that, um, crossing over from being an Israeli writer to being an American writer, an American Jewish writer, so, and writing about Israeli communities and American Jewish communities, but also writing about communities, even a little bit more outside of ours, right? Writing about Palestinian characters, for example. Um, and how does one do that in a way that is authentic, respectful, thoughtful? Maybe just reflect a bit on that.
So again, a good question. And so two things. First of all, I felt that I could write about the Ashkenazi and Mizrahi cultures because I am from both cultures. With regard to the Palestinian culture, my family had close family friends who were not Palestinian, but they were Syrian and they were Muslim. And they were friends. They knew my family in Syria, in Damascus, before my father ever came to the US. And so these were people that we knew. They were incredibly good to us, really kind in the sense that they were able, unlike my father, they were able to go back to Syria every year. They were able to visit my grandmother. My father was able to send money with this family for our family in Syria, who really lived in abject poverty, and also medications. My father was able to get prescriptions here from a very, very kind doctor who would, my father would fill these prescriptions and send this medication that our family needed there.
Just as a quick side note, how long did some of your family continue to live in Syria?
Oh, all the way into the 90s.
Wow.
Yeah, because they were unable to leave. I mean, that's a whole other, that's a
Yes.
whole other
Yeah,
story.
sorry, back to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
question
yeah.
we were
But back to
discussing.
this. So in that sense, I felt that was an element that I couldn't deal with. But with the Palestinian issue, I worked with a Palestinian sensitivity reader. I finished a draft of the novel, and once I felt that it was finished, I sent it to someone that was recommended to me, a lovely woman living in Haifa, who is Palestinian. And she was able to read, she actually read the entire novel the first time, gave me something like 4 or 5 single spaced, or maybe even more, single spaced pages of things that I needed to address.
And
And
so
that,
were there some significant changes that happened?
so there were some significant
Wow.
changes that happened because as thoughtful as I was trying to be, we all come with our own biases. We all come with our own ideas about things. And so she really set me straight about things that worked in the novel that I got right and things that I didn't. Um, so, for example, there was a section that I had put in the novel where the Palestinian mother, Radwa Mahmoudi, um, this takes place in the 60s and early 70s. And so these women are, like Tamar, Mrs. Mahmoudi is works out of the home, as a homemaker, um, has a traditional role in her family the way that Tamar does. And I had put a scene there where the boy's clothes on the line was slightly yellowed. And the sensitivity reader said to me, "Why would you do that? Why would she have yellowed clothes? This makes her appear as a bad housewife, as a bad mother." And I said, "Really?" I mean, for me, it was just a description of clothes. It was nothing that I felt really attached to or anything else. And yet, this was something that really resonated with my reader. And I thought, well, obviously, this is this idea of being a good mother and the importance of that in that community was really brought home to me, right? In a way that I hadn't thought of before. So that was one thing. So once I made the changes, I then had my Palestinian sensitivity reader read it again and got the green light, and I felt much better about it. And my goal in writing the novel was in creating a balanced story to really put humans on the page in the best way that I possibly could, and to humanize each character, to write a human story, with sensitivity and compassion for each of them.
Right. But which actually I think is a good lead into another question that I have. We discussed this a little bit right beforehand.
Yeah.
There are ways in which Tamar, in the course of this novel, does some very complicated and sometimes difficult things. She's in without, I'm not trying to reveal too much, but in a very difficult marriage in which I think sometimes she is somewhat passive. She's not,
Yeah.
it's a little bit complicated to always like her and the choices that she makes. And when I was reading and I was writing out my questions, I kept thinking about, there's a famous quote that's attributed to Jane Austen when she wrote the book Emma. And she says, she said, supposedly she said to her nephew, who was actually the one who recorded this, she said, "I'm going to take a heroine who no one but myself will much like." So I'm wondering if you felt that way a bit about Tamar, or how you felt, and how you deal with writing a character who maybe sometimes does things that are not admirable, but is your character. What is that like as a writer?
Yeah, so I think, well, I love Tamar. I understand Tamar. I have great compassion for Tamar because, as you said, she is in a difficult marriage, in definitely a patriarchal marriage, in the sense that Salim, wears the pants in the family, that he's the boss. He makes the big decisions. He makes a unilateral decision to move the family to the US without her input, without asking her. And there are other decisions that he makes um, without asking her. And so that's one aspect. And the other is that she is terrified that history is going to repeat itself. She does things out of, and they're not very nice things, and I completely agree with you, that we can I think we can understand her. We might not necessarily like her. It's interesting because when I had the copy editor read the book, right, my publisher sent it to the copy editor, and she wrote back saying, "I was with this mother every step of the way." And so I think many of the decisions that Tamar makes are from this position of being a mother and a wife, and honestly believing in herself, like really believing that she has no other choice but to do these things. And I just want to say that for me, writing her, sometimes I would cringe at the things that she would do, literally cringe at the things she would do. And yet I felt that for the character, there was nothing else that she could do. So
Right.
I felt great compassion and understanding for her, even though she's not a person that I would want to have as a friend.
Yeah. I mean, this is fascinating. You see, I would cringe at the things that she would do, right? As if in some ways, right, she's this independent. I mean, and I think a lot of writers talk about this experience,
Yeah.
that she's this independent person and not this creation out of your mind. You just knew, like, this is what she was going to do, and you had to write it down.
Absolutely, absolutely. As if she's being channeled through me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so I definitely, actually, I had that feeling about most of these characters. Others were, where I really felt myself kind of creating, but Tamar was right there, right there. Her passivity, what's under that passivity? How does she grow? What is her relationship with her husband? What is the attraction to her husband?
Mm-hmm.
All of these things. They have a very complicated marriage,
Yes.
sometimes very exciting in a good way, and sometimes not so much in a bad way. And, the book also deals with betrayals and secrets and all sorts of things
Yes.
that, we don't like to think about. The novel is a place to sort of emphasize those things that aren't very nice in human
Yeah.
and yet understandable.
Right. And you don't have a story if people don't have conflict and don't have.
Of course, exactly, exactly.
Yes.
You have to have the conflict to have the story.
Yeah. So let me take this now in a somewhat different direction. Sort of two interrelated questions, right? So number one, you chose for various reasons, and maybe partly because this comes out of the family story and when it was taken, to set this story sort of starting just after the Six-Day War, when Israel takes, sort of conquers the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai, right, Golan,
Yeah.
right? And in the lead up to the Yom Kippur War, and I must say, even as someone who actually, remembers the start of the Yom Kippur War, there was a little piece of me that went, "Oh, right, we're in the fall of 1973. Oh, right, something's coming. It took me a few minutes, like, so I think that's a credit to you as a writer that, I was so immersed in the family life that it took me a little bit, but like, oh, right, there's something else big coming. But what I wanted to ask about, I think, is first situating the story in that time when, for example, there's 50 more years of, Israeli history that your characters don't know yet about the occupation, about subsequent wars, about all the things that are going to happen, and and the settler movement, and everything that's happened. So your characters kind of don't know that all of that is coming yet, and yet you choose to set the story then. But then also, I also saw, I think online, I think it was an interview you did with the forward, I might be wrong, but in which you talked about you were actually in the process of editing this book when October 7th happened.
Yeah.
And so think about, the choice to set the novel in the historical moment you do, and what it means to try to imagine a place in which we don't know all the things that are coming, perhaps. But then also writing the book, editing the book, and obviously putting the book out into the world in a moment when what's happening now is happening. So it's kind of two questions, and you can take it in two parts.
Yeah. Okay, so the first part, the reason that I said it in 67 is because even though Israel started in war, it was a time when the country was very small, more provincial. There was less of a sophisticated feel the way Israel feels now, which feels quite sophisticated to me, and being part of the world stage. I wanted a sense of a kind of Edenic moment after the Six-Day War. Well, before the Six-Day War, I should say, or leading up to the Six-Day War, there was a horrible sense of dread, of existential dread that they were not going to survive another war. And at that time, they were, and this is in the novel, rabbis were sanctioning park grounds in case they needed quick burials. The government was amping up the production of coffins. In Tel Aviv, they were digging trenches, literally in Tel Aviv, digging trenches because they feared that the Egyptians were going to come into Tel Aviv and that the Syrians were going to be throughout the north. And it was a terrifying moment. And then, of course, they turn around and they win in 6 days, right? They make a preemptive strike. They win. Pastor is completely defeated, and so is Syria. And Israel is euphoric, actually believing that they're not going to have another war, that now their neighbors will realize that they are strong, it's a deterrent, and they can now all live in peace, right? Well, of course, and I wanted that kind of innocence. I wanted to begin there. The person who sees what is happening is actually Hadass. Hadass is a kind of Cassandra here, right? She is, on the one hand, happy that Israel won because the thought of Israel not winning really is an existential dread. What does it mean for the Jewish people to not have Israel? To go back into Europe, into the, right, into that, or go back into the Arab world where Jews lived as dhimmis, as second-class citizen, was, anathema. It was a horrible thought. Amos Oz, in his last lecture, actually states, yes, he wants to make peace with Palestinians. He thinks there should be a Palestinian state, and his reason for that, he says, is because he cannot imagine that Jews should ever be a minority again in their own land, right? That they cannot be a minority, that it will destroy them. And so I think that was definitely going through people's heads in 67. So Hadass is pleased that they won, but at the same time really recognizes, and we see this encapsulated in the relationship between Hadass and Daoud, that Hadass understands that now Israel will have to occupy the West Bank because that's the territory that they want.
Right.
East Jerusalem right? They will unify Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
but to be an occupier would put her lover, Daoud, in a position, in an even worse position than he already is, having been exiled from his home, right? From the Arab village, Kfar Ma'an, from being exiled from there.
And I think that's something that Tamar sees for Ruby and Faisal, that maybe Ruby and Faisal themselves are a little too young to have quite figured out and worked out.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Tamar sees this. She understands it because she understood what Hadass was going through. And this
Mm-hmm.
is kind of this mirror image. That's how she begins to see her daughter as a kind of mirror of Hadass, and it terrifies her.
I mean, without giving out away too much, I
Yes,
think the story leaves very open at the end what could possibly be for Ruby and Faisal.
exactly.
I won't tell you how
Exactly.
you get there, but
Yeah, exactly. Um, And the other part of this, sort of ending the book, having the book between these two seminal wars that change everything, right?
mm-hmm.
67 changes the entire map of Israel and the Middle East, and the Yom Kippur War lets Israel know that they are vulnerable. And of course, that reverberates to what happened on October 7th,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, in the Yom Kippur War, Israel loses 3,000 soldiers. October 7th, we lost 1,200 people. We have I think, over 15,000 people who've been soldiers who've been wounded,
Right.
and others who've also been wounded, non-combatants. And so to go to your other question, right,
Mm-hmm.
about my
So of course
feeling.
they're very interrelated questions.
Exactly. They are very interrelated because I really do feel that, you know, if we're talking about these mirrors, that we're looking at the 73 war the way we looked at the way we can almost view it as October 7th, but not, because here's the difference. And this, I think, was what was so devastating. When I called my aunt to see if everybody was okay, because I have young cousins, were they at Nova? I mean, I said to her, "Oh my God, this is like Yom Kippur." And she said to me, "Yom Kippur was soldiers. This is Ezrachim, citizens, a
Yeah.
totally, totally different state of affairs." When I called another friend, he used the word catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I was in the last edits of this book.
Mm-hmm.
I put it away for close to 2 months. I couldn't even look at it. I thought, how in the world could I write a book about Palestinians and Israelis loving each other?
Mm-hmm.
How could I do that at this moment where it the hatred feels so palpable?
Yes. It occurs to me, another controversial book about, I think, romantic relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, sort of the famous novel by Dori Rabinyan.
Absolutely.
Um, it's called All the Rivers in English, and I forget the Hebrew title off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Um, and she too, I think, was asked after, October 7th, and she also made a statement about, like, even having written a novel about a romance between a Palestinian man and an Israeli woman, which if I recall correctly, also had certain autobiographical elements worked in. And she
Yes,
said,
she had.
"I'm
Yeah.
really struggling with empathy right now."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, and it was very difficult to struggle. Yes, I had a real struggle with empathy, and the compassion that I was able to bring into writing the novel I felt bereft of it. I felt as if after what happened, the brutality of it,
Mm-hmm.
the brutality of it was something shocking. It was shocking. And one of the aspects in the novel is brutality. You know, I speak about the men, both Mr. Mahmoudi and Salim, right? A Jew and an Arab, that both of them have this element of tribalism and brutality about them in the way that they deal with their families, their children, all of that.
Although Salim is a man who sort of identifies himself both as Jewish and yet also as Arab, precisely
Absolutely.
because of having grown up in Damascus.
Absolutely. And he is both of those things. That is his culture.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, And finally, though, I had to give the book to my publisher. The reality of the world sort of stepped in. And I went back to the book and I finished the edits. And one of the things that, at my book launch, someone asked the question, did the book change after October 7th? Did you make changes? And, and I basically spoke about everything we're talking about now. And my editor, who was there, stood up and said, I just want to make it clear that there were no changes. I did not change anything. The book stayed as I wrote it. And
does it nonetheless feel different to you in any way because of what happened, because of the events, because of changes?
It feels more hopeful to me. I know that sounds crazy and strange, right? And that I should be.
But it's your interview. You're allowed to feel however you feel.
I should be saying that I'm despairing. And I think we've all felt despair after October 7th. But I also felt something else. And that is that perhaps this was a book that is needed now. Perhaps this is exactly the book that should be out in the world at this time. And it's possible that there are people who will feel, nope, I don't want to read that now. But I'm hoping that a year from now, a reader will want to come to it, or 2 years from now. And I'll just, a short anecdote. I did a reading in Boston, and a Lebanese Jewish man came up to me after the reading. And the first thing he said to me, I want you to know that I have a cousin whose last name is Bukai. I think we're related. That was the first thing. And then he said to me, your book gave me hope. And that is kind of what I am hoping for readers to come away with a sense that there is a possibility, a possibility that something can change. I remember when I worked in a yeshiva for girls in a Beis Yaakov, the Rebbe said to me, it was a very religious school, and the Rebbe said to me, God can come through the eye of a needle. I am hoping that hope can come through the eye of a needle.
All right, so maybe one last question. Given, I think, what you're saying about what you hope your book will do, are there other maybe Israeli writers who you think maybe are working also in this space that people should know about? Are there any Palestinian writers that have influenced you in any way along the way?
So there are Palestinian writers that I like, although, at this point I've been reading a lot more Israeli writers than Palestinian writers, but Hala Alwan is one. She's a poet. She's a really, really good writer. There are things there that I feel uncomfortable with that she says, but on the page, she's a very good writer. In terms of poetry, Mahmoud Darwish is a wonderful, wonderful poet. But again, every time that I meet these writers on the page, I feel like a sense of, oh, it hurts. It hurts, right? Because they're hurting, and I understand the position they're coming from, but I also have my own position that the state of Israel needs to exist. That's it.
And we have our own hurts, as you've mentioned.
Exactly. And we have our own pain, so it's such a difficult and complicated situation. I don't think we can look at it just as black and white. Has every shade of gray possible. In terms of Israeli writers, I absolutely adore David Grossman. To the End of the Land, I think, is a seminal novel. It is besides being exquisitely written, the story itself about the fallout of the Yom Kippur War, I think, is an essential read. Ayelet Sabari, everything she's written, I absolutely love. Her newest book, Songs of the Brokenhearted, talks about the Jewish Yemenite story in Israel, which I think is a really important Mizrahi story to tell. I think that, who else? I've read
I want to just interject. It is worth noting, right? Like we talk about Mizrahi as if that were one big group, but right, Mizrahi extends from Syria, Yemen, all across North Africa, right? Even they themselves are a very diverse.
Absolutely. And I think also for me, it was important to write a Syrian story, from the point of view of a Syrian, because I don't see those stories around.
Mhm.
This is not a story, or there aren't as many Mizrahi voices out there.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I think they're out there. They're just not being amplified in the same way as Ashkenazi voices have been over the course of the last 100 years.
Mm. So maybe we'll conclude with what are some stories you hope to tell in the future?
So I actually, my agent just sent me the Publishers Marketplace blurb for a new novel that is going to be published next year with Delphinium,
Mhm.
and it is from the Ashkenazi side of my family
Mhm.
that deals with, I think, childhood war trauma and its effects on, well, childhood war trauma, that's number one, and its effects in adulthood.
Mhm.
And
It
it's
seems to me that's a minor theme in this novel, maybe with Miriam, Tamar's mother, but
absolutely,
not the primary theme of this novel.
absolutely. And also, I think that we see war trauma, definitely war trauma throughout the novel for everybody.
Mhm. But
I
sometimes
think
it's
that's
World War II trauma. Sometimes it's the Israeli, it's War of
actually the
Independence
Israeli.
trauma. It's
Yeah, absolutely. And this book is specifically deals with Siberian Gulag, and the story is told. You could see this in the publisher's marketplace. The story is told by a nameless narrator who is in a Catholic sanatorium run by Franciscan nuns in Jaffa.
Mhm.
And there she sort of the kind of relives her life, the separation with her husband, the loss of a child, and the relationship that she had with a childhood friend who basically saves her life in a Siberian gulag. So it's a short novel, and I'm looking forward to having it out in the world.
Mhm. And so, if I remember correctly, Anatomy of Exile is your first novel, although you've written much before that. Do you
Right.
think you're going to continue as a novelist or maybe a
Well,
mixed media?
that's a good question. The next book is actually it's the size of a novella, but I'm calling it a novel because it really encompasses a whole life basically. Um, and I really like the form of the novella. I like that a lot, and I would like to try more of that. I'm working on a collection of short stories. And I write poetry. So I really
Mhm.
like everything. Um, I'd like to write another novel. I know that I need to. My publisher has already said that I need to be on my next one. I'm not
Mhm.
quite there yet. I hope to start something this summer. And yeah, but I like it all.
All right. I just will very quickly say I was asked if you could just put the names of the authors that you mentioned, perhaps, or somebody can transcribe them into the chat so that people can
Sure,
have those
sure.
names of some of the
I'm
authors,
going
particularly I think
to,
the first one you mentioned.
uh, uh, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And just a reminder that the information about Wizen Center, if you would like to find out about the Wizen Center, there's a link in the chat if you would like to find out where you can get Zeeva's book. There's a link to the Amazon, and also you can go to Zeeva's webpage and find other places you can get her book. And I see that Zeeva is giving us information in the chat in a moment, so I appreciate
yeah.
that.
I'm just making sure that I have Hala Alwan's her exact spelling.
Right. And then I'm just gonna, we've got a minute, so just if there's any closing words that you would like to say. It's really been a delight to talk to you about this
It
book.
has been a delight to talk to you two as well. Let me just put Hala's, um, her book is called Salt Houses, and she is an incredible poet.
This has been just wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us, Ziva.
Thank you
And
so much.
behatzlacha in all of your future writing projects and in promoting this book and this important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, everybody's time here. Thank you so much for being here and giving me the opportunity to talk about the Anatomy of Exile.